A day after House Democrats unveiled a sweeping police reform bill, Republicans say they're crafting a proposal of their own. It comes as President Trump turns calls by some activists to defund the police into a campaign issue. Skyler Henry reports.
Congressional Republicans say they're working on their own police reform proposals, a day after the Democrats unveiled a massive new bill.
Under the leadership and guidance of Senator Tim Scott, at some point in the near future, we'll have recommendations to be made.
Right now, I haven't seen a package of reforms that I think will go anywhere, but I think there's always an opportunity, so we'll see what develops.
The Democrats' legislation would make it easier to prosecute officers for brutality, create a registry to track police misconduct, and set new standards for the use of force.
Well, there's some of the things in the Democratic bills I could support, some I can't. A national registry of, tracking how often does this occur.
The White House also says it's looking at police reform proposals, but the Trump administration has yet to issue any plan of its own.
We're going to work and we're going to talk about ideas how we can do it better and how we can do it, if possible, in a much more gentle fashion.
President Trump is also facing backlash for questioning the motives of the 75-year-old activist shoved on the ground by Buffalo police officers during a protest last Friday. The president tweeted, "Martin Quijano could be an Antifa provocateur," and said, "I watched. He fell harder than was pushed. Could be a setup."
How reckless, how irresponsible, how mean, how crude. He should apologize for that tweet.
Quijano remains hospitalized in serious but stable condition. Skyler Henry, CBS News, the White House.
Skyler Henry joins me now from the White House. We're also joined by Nancy Cordes and Marquise Francis. Nancy is CBS News chief congressional correspondent, and Marquise is a national reporter for Yahoo News. Welcome to all of you. Nancy, I want to start with you. We know on the Republican side, attempts to craft Republican proposals on police reform are being led by Senator Tim Scott. What more have you learned about that?
Well, Elaine, we've just gotten a hold of the rough draft of Scott's legislation that was shared with Senate Republicans at a lunch. And going over it, I'm struck by how much overlap there is between Tim Scott's plan, which was first reported by the New York Times, and the plan that was released by House Democrats earlier in the week. The way they get there may not always be the same, but they have the same goals. So, for example, his legislation would require reporting of uses of force, as Skyler mentioned, at the hands of police officers. It would also require states to provide data on the use of no-knock search warrants, which we know led to the death of Breonna Taylor last month. It would expand grant programs so that law enforcement officer candidates would have the same racial and ethnic characteristics of the people in their community, foster understanding, and it would require states to maintain a system for sharing records of law enforcement officers. That way, if an officer commits misconduct or brutality in one jurisdiction, they couldn't simply just leave and go apply for a job somewhere else without their new police department finding out about it. So, this is similar in many ways to what Democrats have introduced. And while the devil is in the details, it shows that the two sides may be heading in the same direction. Now, we have seen plenty of instances in the past where both sides were on the same page, more or less, but still couldn't get to an outcome that both sides were happy with. But this is at least a promising start.
So, Skyler, let me turn to you. I mean, you're at the White House there. Given what Nancy just pointed out, the fact that there does appear to be, at least in principle, some common ground here between what the Republicans are considering and what House Democrats would like to see, any indication of how likely it is that President Trump himself would support some of what, or all of what Senator Scott has proposed there?
Well, Elaine, I think what's significant in and of itself is the fact that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are recognizing that there is a problem here and that they want to create some sort of police reform to deal with it. Now, earlier today, we saw Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, as well as the president's advisor and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, meet with Tim Scott. From that meeting, Mark Meadows told reporters that it was still a work in progress, so to speak, and he wanted the stakeholders to establish the priorities, and then he wants the White House to respond with real legislation and action, ultimately saying that action speaks louder than words in this instance. But it'll be interesting to see what comes from Senator Tim Scott's proposals. We also know that other Republican lawmakers are weighing in as well, trying to come up with their own police reform legislation as well. We've heard from Representative Jim Jordan, who's tried to come up with some things on his own as well. He said that he has plans to introduce some things later in this week. And we should also mention that there are a few Judiciary Committee hearings scheduled for this week and next. The House Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing tomorrow where they will hear issues in regards to police use of force, the relationship between law enforcement and the community as well. And so the interesting thing there is that George Floyd's brother will be a witness in that hearing, as well as the family attorney for George Floyd, Benjamin Crump, as well. So it'll be interesting to see if any of the lawmakers take things from that conversation tomorrow and apply that in any sort of legislation moving forward.
So at the same time, against this backdrop, you have, Nancy, Democrats, including New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, calling on President Trump to apologize for pushing a conspiracy theory on Twitter that a 75-year-old protester who was shoved to the ground by police could be part of an Antifa setup, an unfounded claim for which there's been no evidence presented. But when the president makes this type of claim, Nancy, is it clear who his audience is, and how are members of his own party reacting to it?
It's not clear who his audience is besides, people who are already on his side. It's certainly not proven to be a great strategy for broadening his support, especially because this particular allegation, as you pointed out, was completely unfounded. He seemed to be saying that this elderly gentleman threw himself down on the ground and then lay there bleeding because he wanted to make the police look bad. Well, that individual's still in the hospital. He was taken there. He was in intensive care. Hardly the kind of thing that someone would do to themselves just to make a point. And so Republicans tried to steer clear of it today. They tried to say, as they often do, that they hadn't read the tweet. Reporters actually printed it out in advance, knowing that a lot of Republicans would say this, and held it up to them and offered to show them the tweet. Some Republicans took them up on that, but still said that they're not in the habit of commenting on the president's tweets, and they're not going to be able to change his tactics anyway. There were a couple of Republicans, Elaine, who spoke out. One was Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who has been critical of the president in recent days. She said that, that it didn't make any sense. And then Mitt Romney of Utah, who has also been rather critical of this president, in fact, voted to impeach him. He said that the tweet was shocking, but that he wouldn't dignify it with any further response.
Marquise, let me turn to you, because even as lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats, work on some sort of legislation to reform police, there are also calls from activists to defund police departments. And we saw, in fact, the Minneapolis City Council announce support for disbanding the local force. But what risks do the Biden campaign and Democratic leaders in Congress see in supporting that particular idea of defunding police?
Absolutely. It seems to be a matter of rhetoric. A lot of people, including the president, is using defund the police to really say do away with it. But we really know that defunding the police means to actually switch funding from the police to more community-driven and social causes, whether it be mental health or the education system. And I know Democratic nominee Joe Biden was asked, would he support actually defunding the police? And he said no, but he does support reform. And we've seen things in the past for reform, whether that be body cameras or instituting more training for police. And those haven't always worked. We've seen several cases where police and community members have come into a confrontation, and we say, okay, let's see what the body camera has, and we can't see it. So I think it comes to a matter of rhetoric. A lot of Democratic mayors and governors across the country, including in New York City, Mayor de Blasio, have come under fire for not actually being strong against the police. We saw the video of the several officers in a patrol car seemingly trying to run over or protesters, and de Blasio said they acted fine. So it seems as though a lot of politicians are very, they would like to think twice about going against police. So it seems to be a matter of rhetoric, and it could be very dangerous if top politicians come out and say they'd like to abolish the police altogether.
So, Skyler, you're standing there at the White House, where it was just about a week or so ago that we saw, in fact, the president come out in the White House and talk about being an ally to peaceful protesters, but also saying that he was the law and order president. That was just around the same time that we, in fact, saw police forces mobilize on what was largely peaceful demonstration outside the White House. So Joe Biden has come out against defunding the police. The president, though, has been trying to tie him to that issue of defunding the police and what the president calls the radical left. Tell us more about the kind of rhetoric that we've been seeing and hearing from the president on this issue.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing as well, right? This has somehow turned into a political pawn to use in terms of taking shots at the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. But at the same time, what we've been hearing from not only the president and Joe Biden is that defunding the police can mean a variation of different things, right? Depending on who you ask. A lot of people, as Marquise was saying earlier, want this to just mean that the money that goes to several police departments across the country happens to be dispersed a little bit more evenly when it comes to other parts of the community, education, healthcare, and things like that. Whereas, other instances speak to breaking down the police department altogether and building back something else systemically that works to try to keep the community together. We've heard that Joe Biden is interested in looking at community policing and taking advantages of things like that, depending on the certain towns and areas that may be impacted by it. But all in all, I think it's just a matter of how you define the phrase defunding the police altogether. But it'll be interesting to see how the president plans on using this talking point moving forward against Joe Biden and how Joe Biden plans to respond.
Nancy, let me ask you, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer said the Judiciary Committee could mark up Democrats' police reform bill sometime this week. But first, the panel will hold a hearing on police brutality Wednesday. Skyler touched on that. So you're going to have Democrats and Republicans calling some high-profile witnesses. We heard Skyler mention the fact that you're going to have a relative of George Floyd among those witnesses. But I wonder, who else will we be hearing from? And how might the fact that you have now Republican Senator Tim Scott leading Republican efforts, where it does appear at first blush there is some common ground here, how does that potentially change the tone and tenor of what we might hear at that hearing?
Right. I mean, it's a really long list of witnesses, both sides clearly trying to get in a variety of views on this issue. It's a little hard to see how this is going to work, especially because we're still, recall, in social distancing mode, where a lot of members of the committee won't be there in person. Some of the witnesses won't be there in person, so they'll be speaking via video camera, which can cause some delays. But not only will we be hearing from the brother of George Floyd, but we'll also be hearing from top policing officials. We'll be hearing from community activists. We'll be hearing from Don Bongino, who's a big ally of the president's and who has been very tough when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. So that could be very interesting. Clearly what's happening here is the Democrats are trying to move as quickly as possible to capture the momentum. As you pointed out, they're holding this hearing tomorrow. Then they're going to try to mark up the bill next week, which is sort of congressional speak for they're going to get it ready to pass or to try to pass on the floor of the House, which they're hoping could happen the week after that. that. And then they're going to try to put pressure on the Senate to take it up. And that's why you suddenly see Tim Scott and other Republicans moving so quickly to get out of the gate with their own bill, because this is in some ways a messaging battle. Democrats are going to argue that their bill reflects the will of the people and that should be the standard bearer. Republicans are going to say they've got good ideas, too, and that they have worked on some of those ideas in the past with Democrats so that their bill is bipartisan. And then we'll see how it all shakes out.
Well, we know that public opinion, at least for now, appears to be with those demonstrators who have made their voices heard on the streets, no doubt influencing lawmakers on both sides of the aisle when it comes to this issue. Marquise, I want to ask you about another issue, voting. Georgia, Nevada, North Dakota, South Carolina, and West Virginia all held primary elections Tuesday. It was sort of a trial run ahead of November for post-pandemic voting procedures. And Georgia reported some major issues. What are people saying? And could this potentially be a preview of how voting might actually play out in November?
Absolutely. I mean, if this is a trial run, we're in for some danger come November. A lot of Georgia voters, I actually have a friend who I spoke to this morning who voted in the primary today, and there were long lines. A lot of the official polling places had broken machines. They had to switch to paper ballots, and a lot of people actually left the line. And one of the things that we often forget about, we're in an international pandemic. There's a lot of things happening on, and it's really dangerous to have so many people in a line. The machines aren't broken, and when you think about some of the most recent big elections in Georgia that have had such national implications, we saw that Stacey Abrams lost the gubernatorial race to Brian Kemp by 0.4% of a vote, and that a lot of the stemmings from that race were some things that happened behind the scenes that people would say were a little murky. So we're seeing that a lot of the issues that Georgia is having across the board when it comes to voting really could have long-lasting effects, and people, they need to get it together, frankly. Paper ballots are coming up as something that, can you really trust them, who's recording them and whatnot? And, Republicans also don't really are just looking for other ways to hold certain people back. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to voting in Georgia. It did not turn out very well today.
All right, Skyler Henry, Nancy Cordes, and Marquise Francis, a lot of news to go through today. Thanks to all of you for your reporting and insight. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Elaine.